Thank you for being here. I have two topics that I want to address today, and I'll start with the first that is on a lot of people's minds right now, given the Roe v. Wade leak from the Supreme Court of the United States. It is something that's deeply concerning and worrying to so many people. Canadians are worried about the impact that might have on Canada. Women are worried about what that means about their fundamental rights to have control over their own bodies. And I just can't imagine how scary it must be to live in America right now for people, for women waking up yesterday and seeing that leak, and today thinking about the consequences of what that means to their own freedom of their bodies. It's horrific to think about. But in Canada, I want to be clear, we always need to be vigilant to protect the right. And that's something that we'll always be vigilant and always be monitoring. But right now, what we're up against in a real and concrete way for women in Canada is a serious concern about access. Women cannot get access in many communities, rural communities, Indigenous communities. It is impossible to find anything locally. So women are driving hundreds of kilometers. Sometimes it requires a 3-day trip to get an abortion, to access abortion services. So this is really a big concern. And while the Liberals are caught up in fighting the Conservatives over the right, and neither of them have done anything to meaningfully expand access. And so while we believe the most important thing to do is have clinics and access in a meaningful way in local communities, there are things we can do immediately. In this agreement that we have struck, that we used our power to achieve, we are pushing forward on pharmacare with legislation on pharmacare, a formulary of what would be covered, as well as a plan for bulk purchasing. One concrete thing we can do, and we could do it today if the government was willing to support, is to start our national pharmacare program with free access to contraceptives, including the morning after pill. That would be a concrete step towards expanding access in a meaningful way. We know that the cost of contraceptives are prohibitive for a lot of people. It's too much, it costs too much. If you don't have a drug plan, it's something that's a serious question about your budget. And so having that concrete step in the spirit of our agreement, which is to move forward on pharmacare, would be a concrete way to send a clear message that we believe in expanding access, that we're not just going to focus on a right without making sure people have access to that right. And what is the point of a right if it's meaningless? If the right is there, but there's no meaningful access, it undermines the whole purpose of the right. So we're proposing on the pharmacare that we absolutely believe needs to be universal and cover all medication as broad as possible. Let's start with contraceptive. To show that Canada is firmly behind expanding access in a meaningful way. 7 years of Liberals, and they've said great things. They've been great comments made about the importance of protecting this right. But what have they done concretely in 7 years to in any way meaningfully expand access? I would suggest nothing. They've done nothing meaningful to expand access. And if we really want to defend this right, that is how we defend it meaningfully in Canada, is to address the question of access. And that's a starting point that is concrete, that can happen very quickly, and something that we're proposing happen right away. Donc, la première chose que j'ai voulu mentionner aujourd'hui, c'est le fait que c'est vraiment horrifique ce qui s'est passé aux États-Unis, le fait que les femmes ont s'est réveillées aujourd'hui et hier et aujourd'hui continue de réfléchir sur l'impact d'une menace sérieuse sur le droit fondamental d'avoir un avortement. Et on croit profondément qu'on doit défendre le droit. Au Canada, on va continuer d'être vigilant pour défendre le droit. Mais la grande question au Canada, c'est vraiment une question d'accès. On a beaucoup de femmes à travers le pays qui n'ont pas accès suffisant pour les services d'avortement. Donc, c'est quoi le bénéfice d'avoir un droit si on n'a pas accès à ce droit? Donc, ça, c'est pourquoi on a dit qu'on doit augmenter les financements pour les services d'avortement. Mais ce qu'on peut faire maintenant, tout de suite, c'est d'augmenter l'accès dans notre assurance de médicaments, notre programme ou notre engagement dans l'entente qu'on a utilisé notre pouvoir d'obtenir avec les gouvernements. Dans cette entente, on a dit qu'on va aller de l'avant avec l'assurance médicaments universelle. Ce qu'on peut faire, on peut commencer avec birth control dans ces drogues. Donc, ça c'est quelque chose qui va vraiment augmenter l'accès dans une manière concrète. Et c'est quelque chose on veut que ça commence tout de suite. Et si le gouvernement est prêt, on peut passer un projet de loi, on peut prendre des mesures tout de suite pour arriver à un moment où ces drogues sont couvertes. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose de concret qu'on peut faire pour vraiment défendre le droit en défendant l'accès à ce droit. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on propose aujourd'hui. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the real and deep concern around affordability. I think that this can't be highlighted enough. People are dealing with a really serious struggle with paying the bills and making ends meet. This is something that's hurting a lot of families. So what we can do concretely, and just to give a couple of clear examples on the affordability piece, with the price of gas has increased by more than 30 cents per liter for consumers since the beginning of 2022. So in a short period of time, a real significant increase that has hurt families. But in that same time, Imperial Oil has had its highest profits in 30 years. Cenovus, another major oil company, has increased its profits by 7-fold. And they continue to get billions of dollars of subsidies from the government. So let's stop those subsidies and reinvest that public money into renewable options, but also make sure that these companies are paying their fair share, tax their excess profits, and reinvest that into real concrete savings for families, ways to provide them with direct financial support or universal programs that reduce their costs. So that's something concrete we can do. In addition to groceries, this is something that's really shocking. Canadians are expected to see about $1,000 more a year added on their grocery bills. All the while major corporate grocery stores are enjoying also record profits, Loblaws has doubled its profits at the last quarter of 2021. Walmart has got $3.5 billion in profit in quarter 4 of 2022 alone. So we've got significant profits that these large corporate grocery stores are making, and they're increasing the cost of groceries. So again, let's tax our excess profits and reinvest that back into help for people. And there's many options. We can directly send support to people with that revenue that we're able to increase, find ways to lower cost of living by investing in social programs. But let's take a concrete look at the fact that these companies are making record profits, increasing their costs for consumers while they're making these profits. And the government's either giving them subsidies or allowing them to enjoy loopholes, and they're not contributing their fair share, and they're not contributing back to people. So we're pushing for that as well. I think it's a fundamental question of affordability and justice and fairness, and that's what we're going to continue to push for. Donc, la dernière chose que je veux toucher aujourd'hui, c'est la question d'abordabilité. Et en général, ou si je peux résumer la question, c'est vraiment que quand on parle de le coût de l'essence qui augmente ou le coût de l'épicerie qui augmente, dans les deux cas, dans ces deux secteurs, ces entreprises ont réalisé des grands profits. Quelques-uns ont réalisé des profits records alors qu'ils continuent d'augmenter les prix pour les consommateurs, pour les gens, pour les familles, et ils ne payent pas la juste part. Et aussi, le gouvernement les donne des cadeaux, des subventions ou des échappatoires, continue d'utiliser des échappatoires fiscaux qui effectivement dit qu'ils ne payent pas la juste part au Canada. Donc, on propose et on exige le gouvernement de s'assurer, de forcer ces entreprises de payer la juste part et réinvestir cet argent pour aider les familles, d'aide directe financière ou d'investissement dans des programmes sociaux pour réduire le coût de la vie. C'est notre proposition et c'est vraiment important de noter que ces entreprises continuent de gagner des profits records, mais continuent d'augmenter les prix et ça blesse les consommateurs. Et tout le temps, on voit ça dans les cas d'un coût de la vie qui augmente, dans des cas d'inflation. Les travailleurs, les familles, les gens, ils sont blessés par cette réalité, mais les grandes entreprises continuent de gagner plus de profits. Donc, c'est frustrant et on doit réagir. Merci, thank you. And with that, I'm ready for any questions you might have. And I'm going to drink some water.
We'll start with questions in the room. Commencerons avec les questions dans la salle. Good afternoon, Mr. Singh. David Baxter with Global News. Just a two-part question. First off, in saying you want to see contraceptives included under pharmacare, you're strictly speaking pharmaceutical contraceptives like a birth control pill, Plan B, and not necessarily other contraceptives, things like condoms, eh? And second part to that, have you spoken with the health minister about this idea in your negotiations?
In our negotiations, I'll start there. We want the most expansive formulary possible. And the formulary is just simply what will be covered by pharmacare, and we want that to be as broad as possible. And we can look at other countries that have also implemented a broad formulary or a broad list of medication that's covered, and including some medical devices that would help people, for example, with inhalers, a device that makes the inhaler work more effectively. So that's the type of formulary that we want, and we made that clear to the government that that would include contraceptives. And what we're proposing today is that, given what's happened, given the serious concern that people legitimately have, women legitimately have about accessing abortions, that let's do something concrete in the face of a Liberal government that's been in power for 7 years that has done nothing to expand access. This is a concrete step forward, and it is in light of our agreement where we want to move forward with pharmacare. And so it is specifically pharmacare that would include the medication-related contraceptives, as well as so contraceptives on a daily basis, as well as the Plan B or any other post-pregnancy type of contraceptive pill. That's what we're focused on now, but we're open also to other initiatives around expanding what that would be. But that would be in our formulary, starting with those things right now, and I think that would be a real meaningful way to help increase access for people. And I think that's both questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up as well. Some new information from Stats Canada out this morning, pointing to about 27% of the nation's exports being energy products. I know you wanted to see subsidies cut down there, but on the affordability side, many critics will say that these resource revenues play a large role in paying for many of the social programs that your party is pushing for, and especially with the EU looking to get off Russian oil by the end of 2022, that could open up a lot more market opportunities for Canadian energy exporters. So how do you try to strike that balance of decarbonizing the economy when at the same time the global oil demand is not going to go away, and there are more opportunities for Canada to get involved, especially with Russia being phased out by many countries?
Well, I would look at it two ways. One, record profits for any company, but particularly a sector that's now enjoying record profits. There is no justification for a company or a sector that's receiving these huge financial benefits, record profits, and potentially more opportunities to make profits, for them to receive public money. That does not add up. We should be investing our public money in supporting research and development of renewable energies, of the energy of the future, jobs, supporting workers that are impacted by the climate crisis. That's where we should be putting our public money. I think if I can be really forceful here, it's ludicrous to put public money towards profitable companies when they're already making these record profits and raising prices for consumers. I don't think that makes any sense at all. And I think what we should do, and governments have to do, is make investments for the future, make investments where we see the world headed, or we see global markets headed. And we know very clearly the trend globally, not only the necessity because of the climate crisis, but also the global trend in markets is towards renewable energy. Major manufacturers of automobiles are moving to all electric vehicles. We're seeing a clear shift where people are realizing we can't continue to burn fossil fuels. That's going to impact workers. So what are we doing to make sure that there are jobs for those workers that might be impacted? What are we doing to make sure we are leaders in the energy of the future? That's where we should put our public money. Thank you.
Bonjour, Monsieur Singh. Michel
Bonjour,
Sabat de la presse canadienne.
Bonjour.
Donc, Monsieur Trudeau nous a annoncé ce matin qu'il envisage de revoir le cadre légal entourant le droit à l'avortement afin de le solidifier. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Comme j'ai dit en anglais, je pense que c'est toujours important d'être vigilant avec les droits d'avoir accès au avortement. C'est quelque chose de vraiment important. Mais la vraie question, la vraie inquiétude au Canada des femmes, c'est l'accès au avortement. Donc, je veux encore répéter, je suis d'accord avec l'idée d'être vigilant pour protéger les droits, mais la menace à ce moment au Canada par rapport aux femmes, c'est vraiment cette question d'accès. Et les libéraux étaient au pouvoir depuis 7 ans. Et effectivement, ils n'ont rien fait pour vraiment augmenter l'accès. Donc, ce qu'on propose aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment une question de c'est quoi le point d'avoir un droit si on n'a pas accès au droit? Le droit est inutile sans avoir accès. Et ce qu'on encourage aujourd'hui pour régler un vrai problème qui existe dans notre pays, c'est comment on peut augmenter l'accès. Et ce qu'on propose, c'est d'augmenter l'accès aux médicaments pour la contraception. Et ça, c'est en incluant, en commençant l'assurance médicaments universelle avec les médicaments pour avoir des contraceptions.
J'aimerais aussi aborder un angle sur l'Ukraine. Bon, le Canada veut expulser la Russie du prochain sommet du G20, comme vous le savez, mais l'Indonésie ne semble pas très chaude à l'idée. Alors, est-ce que vous continuez de croire qu'il faut expulser Moscou et comment est-ce que ce serait possible d'y parvenir?
Donc, je suis d'accord avec l'idée d'expulser les Russes dans ces rencontres parce que c'est clair que ce qu'ils font, c'est des crimes de guerre, des violations des droits de la personne, une guerre illégale, une guerre qui aucune justification pour cette guerre. Donc, on doit utiliser tous les outils possibles pour dénoncer la décision de la Russie et on doit aussi faire plus pour aider les réfugiés de l'Ukraine pour arriver au Canada. C'est une critique que notre processus, les propositions du gouvernement ne fonctionnent pas pour vraiment accueillir les Ukrainiens. Donc ça, c'est un problème. Deuxièmement, on doit aider, augmenter l'aide spécifiquement aux Ukrainiens pour se défendre et augmenter l'aide humanitaire pour les aider. Donc, ce sont nos demandes comme parti néo-démocrate. On doit faire tout ce qu'on peut pour aider dans une manière réelle et concrète. Et ce sont mes recommandations.
Fraser Needham from APTN National News. So actually this question has to do with the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people. So there's been sort of a history of this government of making maybe platitudes toward the UNDRIP, but when push comes to shove, as we've seen in development projects, whatnot, it gets overridden. So we're following a court case actually in northern Alberta where during the beginning of the pandemic, the government used the Indian Act actually to override custom banned election acts and allow this particular ban to extend its term. And it's still actually using this this piece of legislation to stay in office. And so there's a group of individuals in the community fighting it, but the government is upholding the legislation that they used to allow them to extend the election. So I guess the question is, in current court documents, they have statements from the ISC lawyers saying basically that the UNDRIP is really an advisory tool. It doesn't really hold any sort of constitutional status, whatnot. So I guess the question is, now you're in this agreement with the Liberals. What are you actually going to do to ensure that they actually uphold the UNDRIP, not just talk about it?
With this agreement, and this is something really important, I feel like folks should know, it sets a base of what we are agreeing to work together on, and effectively what we've used our power to obtain that the government would not have otherwise done. So we're able to obtain some significant victories with dental care, pharmacare, more help for housing, Indigenous, for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing as well. But it's not to say that it's a ceiling. We are absolutely within our rights to demand more, to push this government to do more. And in the case of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that is a clear example of where we're going to continue to push more because we need more action. This government certainly was supportive in passing it, but the implementation of it has been a serious question, as you've outlined. So we need to make sure that we are implementing this law into action, into decisions that are made by government, and that this law governs the decisions, particularly as it impacts Indigenous people. And that has not happened to the extent that the spirit of the law would require. And that's an area that we're going to continue to push back and fight back and say this law needs to be applied now. It's not enough for just to be passed, but now it should be applied in a meaningful way to respect the spirit of the law, which is to give Indigenous people that respect and dignity and decision-making and ability to either approve or disapprove of decisions being made in a meaningful way. And that is something that we've yet to see.
I just guess in a follow-up to that, although some people heralded the passage of the legislation on the NDRIP last year around this time, some people felt it was rushed, then that it actually didn't have enough teeth, or sort of it wasn't enough in there actually to force governments actually to actually abide by, both provinces, I guess, and the federal government, by the spirit intent of the NDRIP. Is your party going to push perhaps maybe the government to make amendments to this legislation to make it have, I guess, more teeth, for lack of a better word?
Our first step will be to make sure it's being implemented. And it was passed with a lot of work from Indigenous leaders and activists, and I acknowledge that, and I want to lift them up and acknowledge the hard work it took to get to this point. And we want to see it implemented. If it turns out from response from community members, as we see the implementation move forward, if it's not being implemented properly, if there's key gaps in the legislation, we're always open to pushing to improve legislation. And if it's needed, we'll be able to push for that as well. But I think I believe the first step is actually seeing it implemented in decisions, and then we can assess whether it needs any improvements.
Thea Marnouche from the Globe and Mail. On the topic of free access to contraceptives, you said the Liberals haven't done anything for 7 years. What makes you think they would act on this now?
Well, we want to call out the hypocrisy of, on one hand, making this a wedge issue, on one hand, calling out the Conservatives for not being as clear on their support of it. When the Liberals are in power, if they want to make this a concern, then address the big concern that's been raised by women. And that concern is, sure, we have a right and we need to defend the right without any question. But what is the point of any right if there's no access to the right? The right becomes meaningless. And what we want to see is a real support of expanding the access to deal with that serious question that women have, that we have this right, but it takes us hundreds of kilometers to get anywhere where we can get it done. It's so hard to leave our communities. It's impossible to get access locally. And one concrete step that we could do that would help women in a meaningful way is to at least make sure that contraceptives are covered. We have an agreement that includes pharmacare. And so this is something that's in the agreement that we're going to move forward on legislation. Let's go beyond that and actually start with a key element of the pharmacare, which should be contraceptives. Let's start with that. And so our challenge is to the Liberals that, you want to make this an issue. Let's do something real then. Let's do something concrete. Let's do something that would actually help women and be meaningful and intentional about defending the right by expanding access to it. And so that's our challenge to the Liberals. And if they don't, then really that calls out, that highlights and underlines their hypocrisy, that they just want to talk about it, or they just want to make a wedge with the Conservatives on it, but they're not actually interested in women's rights then. And so that's our challenge. We put that challenge directly to the government. If you want to expand access, we are here. We would support moving forward with contraceptive coverage. That would be real. That would be concrete. And it is a barrier for a lot of women. It's so expensive given the cost of living going up. It's another cost that people just can't afford. So let's move forward. It's our challenge, and it's our offer that let's move forward on this legislation. Pharmacare is included in the agreement. This would be a step forward in a meaningful way. Donc, c'est notre défi au gouvernement. Le gouvernement veut toujours avoir un contraste avec les conservateurs et parler du droit. Oui, le droit est important et c'est fondamental. Mais la question est souvent soulevée par les femmes, c'est quoi le point d'avoir un droit sans avoir accès à ce droit? Donc, si les libéraux veulent vraiment défendre les droits des femmes, on a un défi. Inclure les médicaments pour les contraceptions. Maintenant, tout de suite, on va appuyer ça. Et si les libéraux ne font pas aucune mesure de concret pour avancer l'accès aux droits, donc ça veut dire qu'ils sont hypocrites. Et ça veut dire que c'est seulement des belles paroles pour eux, mais ils n'ont pas des convictions d'avoir des actions concrètes pour vraiment défendre l'accès aux contraceptions pour les femmes. Donc, c'est notre défi qu'on met devant le gouvernement aujourd'hui et on veut qu'il fasse le travail nécessaire pour augmenter l'accès.
Have you spoken to the Prime Minister or the Health Minister yet about including contraceptives in pharmacare, and do you know if they would support this?
When we talked about pharmacare and generally the formulary or the list of medication, that we are pushing for, that we let the Liberals know about, would be the broadest list possible, which would include contraception. That is the type of pharmacare that we're pushing for, as other countries have implemented, because we're the only country that doesn't have medication coverage with a universal health care. We've been able to look at other countries' examples. And so we've laid that out specifically. And given what's happened, given the decision in the States or the potential decision that's been leaked, we want to push at this moment for more access. And we would, of course, primarily want to see more access in the sense of clinics and hospitals so that people can get access to services in their home communities. But another concrete option is to make sure contraceptives are included. So we're making this announcement today as a concrete step, as an offer of something we can do meaningfully if we want to back up not just the right, but the access to this right. And so that's something we've laid out specifically today. But in general, the idea of contraceptives being included in pharmacare was laid out when we discussed what we envision pharmacare to be.
Jordan Gowling, CTV News. Your party's legislation to lower the voting age to 16, was that a part of your agreement at all with the Liberal government to support it?
I was waiting for you to finish. I thought that, yeah, no, that was not outlined in the agreement. It's something that we've long campaigned on. It's been a platform plank in multiple campaigns, and New Democrats have introduced a similar type of bill for a long time. So we believe fundamentally in the importance, and specifically why we're pushing for this bill right now. Taylor Bachrach is our MP who's presented it, is because we've seen a lot of threats to democracy around the world. We've seen threats to free and fair elections, and we've seen the impact on a virtually non-existent democracy in Russia. And the threats to democracy require us to respond, those that believe in it, to respond, to strengthen it. And we've got really good evidence now, given some countries around the world that have put in place the lowered voting age, that it increases the turnout of first-time voters, that 16 and 17-year-olds vote in far greater numbers than folks that just turn 18, 19, or 18 to 24. So it's a big increase in first-time voting. And once they start voting, people are more likely to continue to vote. So it lasts with them for the rest of their lives. So for those reasons, I think it's particularly pertinent right now when we're seeing a lot of threats to democracy. It did not make up a part of our agreement in the sense that we had pushed for a lot more than is actually in the agreement, but that this did not make it to the agreement.
Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino still won't say whether he will share confidential cabinet documents in Justice Rouleau's inquiry into the Emergencies Act. Do you think he should in the interest of full transparency? What's your party's stance on this?
Yeah, we believe in full transparency. We supported the Emergencies Act, but we also believe very strongly in full transparency. We need to know all the information that was available to the government when this decision was made, and we need to know if it was the right decision. We're open to that. I think it's fundamental. That's why the law includes an inquiry afterwards and includes a committee, because we need to know. Canadians ought to know, and we need to learn from that experience. And so we fundamentally believe in full transparency. We need to know exactly why the government made the decision. We operated on information that we were given at the time, and I think it was the right decision. But I'm very open to a finding that maybe it wasn't, and that's the reason why we have accountability measures to make that assessment, to analyze, and to look at what we can learn from this. Maybe there's things that we can improve. Maybe one of the things we know for sure is that there's serious concerns about police that were supportive of the convoy, that encouraged the convoy and actually helped facilitate it in some cases. That's deeply concerning if our own police are supporting a movement that was trying to undermine democracy fundamentally with their memorandum of understanding, which stated that they wanted to replace elected officials. So it's deeply concerning if that is the case, what we've already seen some examples of. So yeah, we want to get to the bottom of this. We want full transparency, and we want to know how we can improve in the future.
And our last question will be online. Laura Husman, the Canadian Press, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for taking my question. Obviously, you want to see pharmacare on the final formulary list, but you've also told us that pharmacare may be phased in over time. Could the NDP support an initial formulary of just essential medicines that does not include a full spectrum of contraceptives?
Well, it's a really good question. I think the formulary that we want to design has to be very expansive and be the widest possible, looking at other countries that have done this. So all essential medication that people need to be healthy. And that would include contraceptives without a doubt. In terms of the rollout, we would be open to starting with certain medication, as I'm suggested today, starting with contraceptives, maybe moving on to diabetes medication or heart medication or cancer medication for out of hospital patients. So the rollout of the coverage could be in phases, but the formulary should be as broad as possible. That's what we've pushed for. And that means all medication necessary for good quality of life, as other countries have done. And we've looked at other formularies from countries, which is basically every other country in the world that's got universal healthcare has formularies. Some are more limited, some are broader. So we believe the list has to be as broad as possible. And then in terms of the rollout, we could roll out with, we can start with some critical medication first and then move onwards. But our plan is a universal, comprehensive, and national program, working obviously with provinces and territories. Much like the Canada Health Act, we need a Canada Pharmacare Act, which is what we're going to pass next year.
And if that formulary ends up not covering contraceptives in the end, what would be the impact of that in terms of the NDP Liberal deal?
Well, that wouldn't be in line with our expectation. It would cause serious problems. We know that the pharmacare that works most effectively in other examples around the world are formularies that are as broad as possible. And so that's what we believe it needs to be. And we would work obviously with experts and provinces and territories to develop that. But it should be as broad as possible. And if it doesn't include contraceptives, that's not appropriate. It is an essential medication for women, and it should be included in the formulary.
And this concludes the press conference. Ici met fin la conférence de presse. Merci.
Thank you so much. Merci.